Voices in My Head Productions presents Shadows of Ishiyama, a Battletech Victorian-Style ghost story. Written by D.G. Martin. Music and sound design by Jon Steadman. Narrated by George Ledoux. Duncan! I thrashed against the call. The otherworldly whispering of my name chilled me once more, as it had every night I'd heard it. Now it invaded my dreams, depriving me of even my sleep as the last remaining haven from the windy whisper of the specters that daunted my every waking moment. Duncan, stay away. I forced my eyes open, hoping to bring an end to the ceaseless repeat of the haunt and the warning not to return to the very place I wished with all my heart to never again see with my own eyes. I opened my eyes, and there I was again. Koji looked back at me, kneeling next to me on the cave floor. I remembered this moment, not long after he had saved me from my downed and inflamed battle mech. My wound was already taking its toll, bleeding through the cloth cinched around my calf in an attempt to staunch the flow. "I've been here before," I said to Koji as he helped me to my feet. The edges of my vision were blurred, and I could not remember if it happened that way the first time, or if it was just the dream causing my vision to haze and shift. "We have to get moving," Koji replied. "You know what is ahead." Koji and I walked down the path, towards the spot in the caves where the lights grew dim and the air even more stale and toxic. Away from the sounds of the match, of which I had been a brief part before my swift defeat, that echoed through the caves and had kept us scurrying from junction to junction so to not be caught in the arena match's action with no mechs of our own. Are you the one calling me back here?" I asked, my voice not rumbling in my throat as it would if I was really having this conversation. It sounded in my head, but I could not force the words from my mouth. But Koji did not hear me. We were already there, the spot where he disappeared into the dark, unavoidable every time. Then, the eyes, there in the dark. Koji propped me up against the side of the cave wall and we exchanged our final nods. As he stooped once more to pick up the rock, he gave me one last look and leapt into the darkness to fight the beast that stalked us through the depths of the caves. Next, just as the first time, the lights of the rescue crew, accompanied by my pleading for them to find Koji. I knew they would not, could not. They would do as they had before. As I drifted off to sleep due to the medtech sedative, I heard it one last time. "Duncan, leave me be." I awoke to sheets drenched in cold sweat, my breath caught for a moment behind my conscious thought, and gasping, I sat upright with a force that jarred my bed and the table beside it. The dreams had to end. I had to find out the truth. One way or another, that end would come tonight. I had found a way back, and I meant to take it. Meant to find the truth of that night. Koji Kenan, the man who saved me and vanished, leaving behind only whispers and nightmares, would be exposed for whatever he may be, a ghost, a spirit, a hoax, a fitful memory in the terrible throes of shock, and haunt me no further. No one recognized me as I hastened down the side street in a seldom visited part of the lower Kobe district. My exit from that evening's dinner party had proven to be more difficult than anticipated, and I was late in meeting my associate. He would not be pleased, but I knew that he would dislike discovery even more than my lack of punctuality. So it was that I regrettably had to delay my planned departure until the rest of the party was suitably deep in libation, enough that my lack of presence would simply go unnoticed, or at worst, register as a casualty of the evening's comings and goings. I had refrained from drink that evening, in order to keep a level head. One of my stature seldom walks the streets of Solaris City without attracting attention of some kind, and I knew that alone the simple act of engaging in our purpose without being spotted would take all the subterfuge I possessed. Employing the aid of a stage actor who was of similar stature and heritage to myself was, I was now sure, not necessary, but such was the import of the evening's affairs that I deigned to not chance being followed. Thus, my trained and directed decoy, who of course knew nothing of my true purpose, was no doubt seen entering the building in which I kept apartments, and was even now likely drinking from my own stores and keeping a low profile, until such time that I relieved him from his vigil. I circled the block twice to make sure I was unfollowed, and approached the side door of the fourth building in the row, appearing from the outside as an unlit derelict, void of inhabitants and shut against any would-be unwanted visitors. The rest of the street was little different, and I wondered to myself if, like the building I now approached, all or any of the abandoned houses were also secretly sheltered to untold plots that were even now, as my own, in the process of unfolding. Raising a gloved hand, I paused before knocking. This was my last chance to walk away, but I knew I would not take it. The need was now too great to withstand. Only my companion who waited on the other side of the door could help me tame the rising in my chest that would not cease. Lowering my hand to the door, I knocked in the cadence prescribed for entry. I waited in silence for the door to open, and my head turned left and right, peering down both sides of the building and into the street beyond to make sure that my presence was still unmarked. Every shadow in my vision was a possible venue from which an unseen onlooker might note my actions, and each heartbeat that passed before the door opened sounded heavier in my chest as my weight drew out longer than comfort allowed. I started slightly as the door suddenly opened without warning of unhinged bolt or turned knob. An eerie light peered out into the darkened alley, dying before illuminating the street beyond, as if a barrier existed between the two positions, not allowing for any transgression between the light in the house and the dark of the street. I did not wait for the door to open fully, and rushed in once I was sure the opening would accommodate me. The door closed behind me, and I turned on my heel to greet my companion, a weight lifted from my soul to have made it this far, only still at the beginning, into our plan.
"You are late,"
Rinsho Kenan stated simply, in his usual untenable tone, latching the bolt back to its previous position. He said no more as he moved past me and further into the room. "Couldn't be helped," I said, removing my coat and hat and hanging them on the hooks next to the door. Rinsho let out a short grunt in response, and I followed him into the next room and down a staircase that led to the basement. The old, badly maintained staircase creaked as we both quickly descended. I sensed that Rinsho possessed the same sense of purpose and impetus to be about our task that I felt, and I was happy that he made no more mention of my delayed arrival. Upon reaching the bottom of the stairs, we crossed the basement. Rinsho had positioned a small omnidirectional light in the far corner to help us see our way through the crates and supplies left behind by whatever tenants had abandoned the structure perhaps decades before. Nearing the light, I made out a square-shaped hatch in the floor at the corner of the room. "So, this is the secret," I thought, as Rinsho stooped to grab a ring attached to the latch and lifted the door on its hinges with no small amount of effort. He had opened the door before, it was clear, but how far beyond it he had traveled, I had no idea. "So, you found a way into the caves," I said. It was not a question. His nod in reply signaled the moment I had both dreaded and hoped would come for these past weeks. After waking up in that hospital bed, the specter of my time in the cave still addling my brain, and visions of Koji and the monster he battled in the dark, battled to save me from, refusing to leave my thoughts, there was Rinsho. Our meeting, chance though it was, could not have possessed a finer purpose. Though we had conversed extensively over the course of several weeks, many aspects of Rinsho Chinen remained a mystery to me still. How had he found me out so easily and tied me to his missing, long-dead ancestor, whom I happened to meet in the caves? These and many other questions I had yet to answer, even in the weeks since our meeting in my hospital room, but I felt that the answers would come in time, and this, tonight I felt, would be that time.
Yes, Duncan,
he replied after a moment.
Beyond this is a passage that has been long forgotten by any on Solaris. It connects to an access safety shaft that was cut into the cave several centuries ago by those who built the first version of the arena.
Have you been down it? I asked, my heart now pounding in fear and excitement. He shook his head slowly.
I haven't been into Ishiyama proper yet, but I've gone as far as finding our way in. That was why I contacted you again. I knew you would want to come with me the first time I journeyed into Ishiyama.
I nodded and followed him down the hatch. At the bottom of the iron-rung ladder, my feet landed on a crumbling ferrocrete construction. It was easy to tell that it was of much older construction than the neighborhood above it, if only by the look of the age and wear on the floor and walls. The smell, neither remarkably pleasant nor unpleasant, belied an aged grandeur that I had seldom, if ever before, experienced, and rarely since.
"Come, this way,"
Rinsho said, not in a full-volume voice, but instead somewhere between that and a whisper, as if he was afraid that something down there might have heard him. He handed me a light and quickly turned to lead the way. We walked down a wind of passages, taking so many turns that I was quickly lost. Without Rinsho's guidance, I had no hope of finding my way out of these access passages, and the thought chilled me even as I swept my light from wall to wall, searching for something that might tell me where we were going. The simple act of following also allowed my mind to wander, and it went straight to where it had dwelt for the past weeks, upon my last visit to the Ishiyama Caves arena. I had been in a battle mech then, well, for some of the time. My mech damaged, I had to abandon it in the caves, and the experiences that followed were the sole purpose for my current clandestine return trip. The man ahead of me in the passage had, alone, believed the tale of what happened to me in the caves of Ishiyama. And I was glad for it. I surely would have committed myself by now without his belief and tenacious drive to help me find the truth. The truth. That was what we were walking towards, or so we believed, so I hoped at the time. I had met someone in the caves. It was someone who I should not have met, and he saved my life. Twice, in fact. I owed Koji my life, and then some. But upon my rescue from my ordeal in the caves, Rinsho had informed me of my true trouble, which was only beginning. Kojiro Chinen was dead. He had been dead for 100 years. He died in Ishiyama, just like I should have, had he not saved me. It was impossible. Everything I was, everything I wanted to be, told me that what I had experienced in those caves was impossible. But here I was, and more, I had promised, perhaps in too much of a drug-induced state to be reliably held to my vow, to help Rinsho find his long-dead relative, to help him, if possible, find peace. It was insane. Our errand was to find a ghost, to put it to rest. What was I doing there? I had a mind to turn back, to leave Rinsho and find my way out of this, to let the past die, as it rightfully should. I should have turned back, but I did not. Rinsho led us onward. After half an hour walking through the Star League-era tunnels, we crossed a junction that marked a new set of passages. These were definitely much older, and I felt as if we were now treading on holy ground, so undisturbed and quiet were the halls. Made of a substance more akin to rock, the walls of these older caves seeped moisture in some places, and mold added a rank smell to many of the areas we passed. Several more turns, and Rinsho stopped and turned towards me.
"This is almost as far as I have gone."
He turned halfway to shine his light on a spot in the hallway several feet in front of us that was broken away. A man-sized hole was opened in the wall, primitive digging tools propped up against the wall next to it. "You found it," I said, marveling at the realization that I was where I was, only a few steps from being back in Ishiyama. Rinsho had not told me, but I knew what was on the other side of that hole. Rinsho nodded slowly. "Are you sure you want to do this?" "No, absolutely not. I could not face this again. While I had lived through it, the experience in Ishiyama had been just another ordeal, a fight to survive. But when Rinsho told me of the fate of his great-great-grandfather's brother, that Koji had been dead long enough to be naught but a pile of bones, I had lost all ability to understand the true horror of what had transpired. Until this moment. I stood there, frozen, unable to answer Rinsho, and something in the air changed. It was as if the caves felt me returning to them. The slight pull of air pressure against my skin, a force pulled at me to return to Ishiyama. I felt it urge me, and then the whisper. "Duncan." I jumped at the sound, and Rinsho also jumped a step back in response. Did you hear that?" I breathed heavily as I asked, hoping that Rinsho had simply whispered my name and I was too distracted to notice. Rinsho did not answer, instead slowly turning his head toward the entrance to Ishiyama. "I feel it too," he said. "I feel it pulling me to go in." I was trapped. I could neither turn back nor go forward. Behind me was doubt, confusion, and the knowledge that I would forever question all I had seen and heard up to this point. Before me was the unknown, driven by a force that beckoned my every sinew to venture forth and embrace it. I feared once more that I was truly going mad. If not for Rinsho also acknowledging the pull of Ishiyama, I might have been truly lost to the dark in that very instant, never returned to my old self, a shell of nothing. I felt the decision was impossible. I felt the decision was unavoidable. "The maintenance crews have left by now." Rinsho's voice was abrupt and shocked me from my reverie. "We will have the caves to ourselves for several hours. We should go now." Rinsho's renewed impetus to enter Ishiyama was a stark contrast from his previous utterance acknowledging the force that beckoned us to enter. "Then," I said, feeling out of control of my own will, "let us be about our business." With that, Rinsho turned and led the way through the hole, disappearing into the dark portal without any ceremony or preparation of will. I was not so resolute, despite my assertion that we should proceed. As I bent down and lowered my head to go through the portal, I paused once more, a primal, animalistic part of my psyche pleading with me not to carry out my next action. As if in response to this instinct, the air between the passages surged inward towards Ishiyama, and I lost my precarious balance, falling headfirst through the portal. I rolled once as the unexpected downward slope took my lead foot from under me, and from there I tumbled the few remaining feet through the portal, landing hard on a too familiar stone surface. I felt a pair of hands grab me immediately, and by instinct I repelled their grasp. "Duncan!" Rinsho pleaded, again in his half-whisper, which now was swallowed immediately by the larger cave around us. I paused and regained myself, allowing Rinsho to help me to my feet. I stood there for a moment, my eyes adjusting to the grim red hue of the emergency tube lighting that ran along the upper walls of the Ishiyama caves. There I was, standing in the very place over which every bit of my body had warred with every other bit of my body both to be and never again to be, pulling me in and driving me back in the same breath. But that was over now. That battle, for gain or loss, was decided. And though I had never understood the strings of fate and plot that drew me to the spot, it has remained a truth undeniable to me that no matter how strenuously I had fought against it, I was going to lose. If for no other reason than I had to know if there was any escape from what had befallen me. So for that moment, I resigned myself to one truth, the only truth of that night,
to which I still look to as the only constant and indisputable fact of science in the whole endeavor. I was back. "Hey, Duncan!"
Rinsho interrupted my realization and pulled me back to the task at hand. "Do you know what part of the caves this is?" I asked, shining my handlight up and down the wall across from us. Rinsho shook his head. I had not expected him to know. We had emerged in a tunnel that, I was sure, nobody could have told for certain was in any particular part of Ishiyama. The Iron Mountain Arena's secrets were known only to a few, and even then I doubted that those who considered themselves knowledgeable on the arena did not know everything about it.
"Which way should we try?" I asked,
still unable to talk much above a whisper. I was afraid of who might hear me. No, I was afraid of what might hear me. Rinsho shrugged and pulled a small canister out of a pack on his belt. He shook it for a moment before pointing at the wall and waving his arm in a pattern I did not fully follow, our lights directly pointing in the other direction. "What?" I began to ask, but Rinsho swung his light to a point at the spot on the wall, and I saw it. The light reflected a bright silver arrow pointing to the left of our entrance portal. When Rinsho moved the light so it was not directly pointing at the arrow, it began to disappear from sight. "Clever," I thought to myself. "Invisible except to our lights. Well done, Rinsho." I nodded, and we turned to go in the direction of the arrow. We walked slowly, taking our time. I do not believe either of us knew exactly what we planned to do in the caves or for what we looked. All we know was that Koji's spirit, dwelt somewhere within these passages, and I was resolved to find him again if I could. That, or find proof that all of this was a sham. To battle that thought, I began thinking about reasons why Rinsho should be so committed to finding his relative's ghost down here, other than just to embarrass and discredit me. The story of what had happened to me, of being rescued by and hobbling to safety with a man who died in the last century, had thankfully never made it to the tabloids. So for that, at least, I knew Rinsho was not looking to make a quick buck off of my low-level Solaris 7 fame and fortune. The other possibilities, which ranged from Rinsho being a simple thrill-seeker to his family wanting to make sure a terrible secret, like that they were really serial killers who hid bodies in Ishiyama to cover up their familial habit, continued to run through my stream of consciousness to varying degrees, covering all possible likelihood and probability. As a gambling man, I had always considered long shots to be saved for when one was having an extremely good night, or otherwise an extremely bad one. Which one tonight was turning into, I still did not know. We walked for almost an hour in silence, shining our lights to follow every sound, every echo, every half-shadow that darted across our paths. Every time we made a turn, Rinsho marked the passage with another arrow. This comforted me in the moment, but I did not know why. Rinsho's preparation for this night was extreme. He had been after Koji's ghost for a long time. It was a family legend, and I was the only Solaris pilot this century who had ever spoken Koji's name after becoming lost in the tunnels. Rinsho needed my story to be true, perhaps even more than I did. One troubling fact that began to gnaw at me was that I had not seen any telltale signs of battlemech combat anywhere. No scraped walls, no paint transfer from shoulders bumping into the corners, no autocannon shells, no scorch marks from errant laser beams. If anything, the walls of Ishiyama that we had seen made me believe that no matches had taken place in the caves in a very long time, perhaps never. That simply could not have been the case, I knew, but the lack of evidence to the contrary puzzled and vexed my mood with every stop.
"Did you hear that?"
Rinsho said suddenly. He had not spoken since we started walking, and the sudden sound of his voice was jarring after spending so much time straining to hear sounds that were not our footfalls. I paused my stride and looked over to him. I had heard nothing, having been much too deep in my own thoughts on the virgin condition of the cave walls, but it was clear that he thought he had. We waited for over a minute, listening. I dared not ask him what he thought he heard, for fear that my talking would drown out any chance of hearing it again.
Duncan.
The whisper was accompanied by another shift in the air pressure, the first I had felt since entering through the portal, and the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stiffened at the airy call that sounded my name. Rinsho shone his light in my direction, enough to see my face, and his eyes widened as he looked to me. No, as he looked past me. I dared not turn to see what Rinsho saw, instead transfixed on the look of puzzlement, which turned to realization, and then, to my own surprise, momentarily to grief. Before I could decide what to do next, Rinsho leapt forward, bounding faster than I had believed any man capable. He ran past me, and I felt the wind from his passing as it shocked me out of my own inaction. I turned to follow him, not knowing what it was he now pursued. By the time I turned and took my first few steps, Rinsho was a dozen or more paces ahead of me, his light already beginning to dim as the red hue of the cave swallowed both it and him. I had never in my life been out of shape, but my wounds and limitations from my previous visit to Ishiyama had not yet allowed me to regain my full prowess. I soon learned that Rinsho, to my surprise, had me physically outclassed. Rinsho's speedy pursuit of whatever he had seen behind me was absolute, and I found myself alone in the caves, unable, even when stopping to listen, to hear which way Rinsho's pursuit had taken him. I soon ceased chasing after him, and thinking better of blindly calling out to him in the dimness, I slowed my pace of progress and began looking for signs of Rinsho's passing. Before long, my light picked up on one of Rinsho's arrow signs. It looked more hastily drawn than others, and I wondered if I only hoped that to be the case, that I had found a new and freshly drawn arrow instead of one that Rinsho had previously placed during our hour of silent walking. It was not until I resumed the slower pace that my mind had time to catch up to events that had just unfolded. I had heard it again. I had felt it again. Whatever was calling to me in Ishiyama, it had been near enough to hear not just with a feeling or an impulse, but with my own ears. And, even more compelling to the argument that I was not wrong to trust my previous experiences, Rinsho clearly saw something behind me. I wished in that moment I could have known what he had seen. It would have helped me to understand why he left me as he did, abandoning me to once again wander the caves and find a way out. Fortunately, this time there was not an ongoing arena match that I had to avoid. No chance of Battletech stomping on my helpless form and ending Duncan Fisher, perhaps by chance damning me to the same fate to which Koji was bound, to wander Ishiyama for all eternity as a specter of a forgotten match. My instincts told me to stop walking as my brain caught up, processing with all haste something my handlight had just illuminated in a far corner of the nearby stretch of cave. It was a shiny something, and it was small. Upon locating the small, shiny something with the light once more, I looked around, expecting nothing and everything, I suppose, before walking over to inspect the tiny mystery. I crossed to the other side of the cave and stooped down on one knee to get a better look. Tucked almost completely under a small rock that was wedged near a boulder about half the size of a mech's foot, there was a tag of some sort. I reached out to grasp the small tag, and upon lifting it up to read it, my breathing stopped. My heart pounded in my chest as I read the words stamped into the dog tag. Just 2 words, but they were the only 2 words in existence. The only 2 words I was sure I could comprehend in that moment. Kojiro Chinen. My mind raced past the obvious in that instant, instead landing on the least obvious facts about my new circumstance. Was I being goaded even further? What are the chances that I would happen, by sheer chance and against long odds, to find here, visible for any passerby to see, the clearly readable dog tag that once belonged to the man whose ghost I had set out to find? I was, in that instant, more convinced than ever that Rinsho, or someone else, had set this all up. This was too much. A hand overplayed in a round where I had almost folded. No, this was too much of a bluff, and someone would have to pay for this. Duncan Fisher was no fool. Right?
I looked again at the dog tag. It was worn, yes, not fresh by any stretch. Could it have indeed survived a century in this very spot without being disturbed or noticed? I was not given long to ponder the question, as in the next moment I began hearing what sounded like struggling farther down the cave path. In my moment of confusion, a small bit of fortune shone upon me, and I did not shine my light in the direction of the sound, but instead stayed as I was, one knee still in the dirt, turned mostly away from the direction of the sound. And there I waited, until I could better ascertain the nature of the sound. I feared that doing the wrong thing would be just as disastrous as doing nothing. It was a moment after I acknowledged that fear that I knew what I was hearing. Rinsho. He was running. Still running? Towards me. I wanted to call out to him, to let him know I was there, but I was silenced by the notion that he could be pursuing something, or worse, fleeing from something. In the case of the former, that meant that something, whatever it could have been, was positioned between Rinsho and me. I had scarce contemplated the possibility when a pair of hands grabbed me from behind, clutching the shirt atop my shoulders and lifting me into the air. I flew for but a moment before I fell back behind the boulder beside which I was previously kneeling. I hit the ground hard, sure that my tailbone might have just broken, when the hands once more grabbed my shoulders and threw me back against the boulder. It was not a violent action, but it did steady me and prevent me from struggling. Finding my sight was with me once more, I looked up and nearly choked on my own breath. Koji! He knelt directly in front of me, his hands still on my shoulders. Looking down directly at me, he moved a hand off my shoulders only to press a finger to his own lips, a signal to which I nodded my understanding. Why I did not question the circumstance, I am sure I will never know, but finding Koji in that dark place felt like being reunited with an old friend rather than once more being face to face with a man I now knew to be long dead, a spirit wandering the lands of the living, for what purpose I still knew not. By the sound, I could tell that Rinsho was still fast approaching, and I made motion for us to move in order to greet him, but Koji held me in place and shook his head, a warning I was not keen to ignore, considering how well the man before me had kept me alive when we last had met. Rinsho drew nearer, and when he was close enough that I was sure he was directly on the other side of the boulder, he stopped. I heard his heavy breaths, a slight stomp to his footfalls, and I saw his light dash over the cave walls, narrowly avoiding drawing line of sight to where Koji held me propped against the backside of the boulder. Though I would not have claimed to know Rinsho overly well, the manner of his breaths and unsureness of his footfalls indicated to me that he was frustrated. Perhaps he had pursued Koji this way, and the spirit, encountering me yet not wishing to expose himself to his living relative, was hiding. I looked up at Koji, who now wore at once a determined and concerned face. In our previous encounter, Koji had seemed to be more restful somehow, as if he had been able to get enough sleep to face whatever challenges befell him. Now he looked ragged as I had felt that day he rescued me from my fallen mech. Rinsho continued to pace and was now mumbling to himself in his native tongue. Lacking even a basic understanding of the language, I still understood the tone of his frustrations and his anger. Why was Rinsho angry? He had never before exhibited much emotion past the excitement of finding another clue concerning Koji, but this Rinsho now sounded as I had never before heard him speak. Between Koji's physical insistence and a growing sense of unease, I found that I did not want Rinsho to know I was behind the boulder. So I waited. Either he would look behind the giant rock, or he would not. I doubted that I had any power to influence which happened. It was, I would later muse, the closest to a true coin toss of a bet I had ever made. Fortune smiled on me once more as I heard Rinsho begin to wander off, back down the direction from whence he had come running, now several minutes before.
Koji did not move for several more seconds after the sound of Rinsho's footfalls disappeared down the tunnel. Slowly, Koji released his grip on my shoulders and fell backwards from his hunching position, landing on his backside and letting out a sigh of relief. I had yet to move from my position, and Koji's lips formed a tight but noticeable kind of smile that indicated he might have understood at least a little bit of the situation from my perspective.
"Apologies, Duncan,"
Koji said, in the same half-whisper that affected all who attempted to speak within the caves, even, as evidence would suggest, a spirit.
"I had no other way to warn you before I had to hide you from him."
The puzzled look that appeared on my face must have told Koji everything he needed to know about what to say next, for his next few statements answered all of my lingering questions about what just happened.
"I have been following you since you entered the caves over by the hole that Rinsho opened up,"
he began, his tone hushed and hurried, as if his explanation had a timer upon the expiration of which we would both be counted on for action.
"Rinsho is not to be trusted," he continued. "I heard him tell you that he had not yet been back to Ishiyama and was waiting for you to return, but that was not the truth. He has been here, in the caves, walking the halls for weeks, almost since the day after we last parted."
Koji halted his explanation suddenly and peered around for a moment before looking back to me. As he turned, my light caught the side of his face as I shifted it in my hand, relaxing my iron-like grip which had been maintained for far too long for comfort to continue. Rather, my light shone through the side of his face, to the wall behind him, and I once again remembered that I spoke not to a man of flesh and blood. Koji was a ghost. My mind no longer fought the possibility that he could be anything but, and with the assenting thought came peace and fear at once. Peace that I no longer had to question. Fear that I was a lone man in contact with mortal proof of the immortal truth that death might not be the end of all things.
"Duncan,"
he said, pulling me back to the present,
"we must move. He will be back this way, and I need your help before the night is through."
Koji stood and offered me a helping hand to do the same. I took his hand, which felt solid, flesh and blood to my touching senses, and helped me onto my shaky legs. Without waiting for me to stabilize myself any further, Koji turned and walked out from behind the boulder.
"So, he lied to me,"
I said, still not fully comprehending anything that had happened since Koji had reappeared to me minutes before. Koji nodded.
"Yes, and there is more."
His eyes narrowed as he peered down the cave in the direction Rinsho had last ventured.
"Do you remember the beast that I battled the night that we walked together in the caves?"
Of course I remembered. One does not forget the truly frightening moments of life, no matter how questionable or unreliable the senses might afterwards prove to have been. I nodded.
"Duncan, you must believe me when I tell you this. The beast I fought that night, that I fight every night again and again, suffering untold wounds and pain, it is Rinsho."
You know what you are?" I asked in response. Upon reflection, it was not the question I should have asked. I had just been informed that my most constant companion for the past several weeks, the man who until a few minutes before I quite assuredly had trusted with my life several times just that evening, was a dangerous spirit beast of some kind. But in that moment, I was transfixed by the revelation that Koji, a ghostly apparition caught in an endless loop of pain and destruction, was once more cursed by the knowledge of it. My heart, my soul ached for Koji and his predicament. It was one thing to be a ghost and not know it, but it was an entirely different prospect to know that one was truly and surely damned to an eternity of torment. I knew in that moment I must assist Koji in any way possible. That was when I collapsed from the shock. My brain, addled and stretched thin, was processing too much information at once, and my conscious thoughts had chosen to only dwell on the part of them that did not require me to face the terrible demon of my current situation. Rinsho was a spirit too, but he was different from Koji. So different, in fact, that I would never understand exactly what, or who,
Rinsho truly was.
Koji knelt next to me and checked my vitals. When I was sufficiently recovered from my collapse, he answered my question.
Yes, he stated simply, and Rinsho is not, as he has asserted to you, my modern-day relative. He is much closer in relation to me than he has suggested.
Oh, was all I could manage in response. I knew more troubling news was coming, and more, there was nothing I could do to stop it.
He is my son.
But the sound made its way from between my lips before I could stop it. It was too loud for the caves, and it rebounded and bounced down along the cave wall. I knew in that instant that my utterance would doom us both.
Yes,
Koji said, grabbing my hand and helping me to my feet once more. He looked down at his dog tag, which I still held in my hand. I had forgotten it was there, and looking at it with Koji, I felt as if he was passing his meaning and his purpose somehow through it to me. I was now bound to Koji, and he to me. Rinsho was just as much a threat to me as to Koji, and the beast now stalked us both, once again, just as it had the night Koji saved me.
We were a team back then,
Koji continued, as he turned to walk down the cave. I was now worried that Rinsho lurked around every corner, but my single small solace was that, for the moment, Koji did not appear to be worried. An arena team? I asked, knowing the obvious answer, but still compelled to somehow let Koji know I was following his story.
Yes,
Koji nodded before continuing.
And we were a force, to be sure. The father and son duo, Kenan Force, was what they called us. Yes, perhaps a bit too cheesy, even for Solaris 7, but the games are about nothing if not fun and being a little cheesy.
It was strangely sobering to listen to Koji talk about his life. Having lived in the previous century, the true stories of Kojiro and Rinsho were completely unknown to me, even though when I questioned him about it, Rinsho had assured me that he was only named after a relative who was a contemporary to Koji. But hearing a ghost talk about his life, as if it was naught but a flashback to an easier time, was a different kind of shock from what I had repeatedly suffered all night. It was the kind of shock that one wanted to experience again. "What happened?" I asked, hoping that Koji was willing to continue his story.
Rinsho, my son, was reckless in his personal life. I was no saint, mind you. This place does not cater to such a person. But Rinsho's success in the arena led to his belief that he deserved the same kind of success, the same kind of celebrity in all aspects of life. He fell in love with a girl.
Koji paused his story as he neared a junction. There we stood for several moments, listening for signs of Rinsho's approach. Upon hearing nothing, Koji turned down a path leading down, and I quickly followed. I had switched off my light before we began walking, much earlier, for fear that it would attract Rinsho, and realizing that my sole purpose for even having it was now questionably ruined.
This girl was a true beauty, and he soon wanted to marry her. I was happy for him, of course, as any proud father would be. Our family came from a traditional background in the Capellan Confederation, but those traditions had long since died out in our line, from the time of my grandfather, who first ventured to Solaris 7 in search of glory. But as with all things, I suppose, nothing is as it seems. The girl was not who she said she was, and Rinsho soon found out that she worked for a rival stable, her mission to compromise Rinsho for the sake of money and arena winnings. She was good at her job, too, for soon she had convinced Rinsho that he could be much richer if he played a dangerous game within the arenas, the game of fixing fights and taking falls. And that led us to the Ishiyama caves, the day we both died, at the spot towards which I am taking you now. It was down here that my own son betrayed me to his love, both of a woman and of money. I do not believe he meant for me to die here, but his own death sealed his rage against me and has brought us all to this spot tonight.
As he finished speaking, Koji came to a halt. The spot of cave in which we now stood appeared oddly familiar, a somehow older part of the caves, or perhaps just more run down. The more I looked around, the more I knew I had been here before. Koji stood with his back to me, looking at a bend in the cave wall. This was where he had died. This was where Rinsho had died. Had the father killed his son for his betrayal? Was that why they were both cursed, doomed to repeat their fight endlessly?
I knew he would bring you here.
Rinsho's voice sounded in the dark, and Koji and I both rounded to face the direction of the noise. Rinsho stood before us, only a few yards away, but for the first time I laid eyes on the true Rinsho. He was dressed as a Solaris 7 mechjock, just like his father. And just like his father, his uniform was torn, battered, and shredded in several places, the only remaining signs of the wounds that had ended both of their lives.
Told you this story, did he?
Rinsho said, cocking his head to the side and revealing a look of anger and resentment I yet before never witnessed him exhibit.
Told you all about how I betrayed him, led him down to this remote part of the caves, turned my battlemech's weapons upon him and fired?
He told me everything before that, I managed to say in return. Rinsho's betrayal was not just of Koji, but of me too, and I felt at once ashamed at my foolishness for not seeing him for what he was before then. My body began to shake with the knowledge that I was the only being of flesh and blood in all of Ishiyama, despite the presence of my two companions. But, I continued, taking a step towards Rinsho and ignoring for a moment Koji's protest at the action, what he hasn't told me is why. Why me? Why now? And more relevant to my personal involvement, how did you leave Ishiyama in order to draw me back in? Rinsho smiled. A truly evil grin if ever I witnessed one. A self-pleased and mastermind kind of smile that one might see from a hollow-vid drama villain.
Why, you carried me out with you, Duncan, of course.
I looked to Koji, who only shrugged, and back to Rinsho. Carried you out? How? Rinsho pointed to my right leg.
The injury you sustained that night, Duncan. The rag you found and used to bind it. I dropped that rag there for you to use. I made sure, after seeing your bumbling fall and my father's intervention, that you took something of mine with you, away from Ishiyama. That was how I appeared beside your bed in the hospital, how I helped you plan the excursion back into this hell, and it is how you ultimately helped me bring an end to my father, once and for all, bringing me my final peace.
It was too much to take in, too much to absorb all at once. No man should ever have to try to understand the like of what was happening to me in that instant. How am I the way that you will end your father, I asked, unprepared to think any further on holding counsel with not one but two spirits. Koji had remained silent almost this entire time, but I finally noticed that my hand was getting warmer, the hand that still held onto Koji's dog tag. Of course, this is it. The dog tag is just like the piece of cloth. The piece of cloth that I had, for a reason completely unknown to me at the time, felt the compulsion to bring along with me in my pocket. I reached a hand into the pocket and drew out the cloth. I stood there for a moment, ignoring both Koji and Rinsho, staring at the two objects. These were what bound the two men, father and son, arena partners, to this world. These objects kept them here, fighting eternally. Somehow, among all the endless rubble and cleanup and battles and recoveries and construction and reconstruction of the past century, somehow these two things had remained here in Ishiyama, Koji and Rinsho along with them. In that moment, looking at the two items, I knew what I had to do. Rinsho deserved this hell for his betrayal, but Koji did not.
Duncan,
Koji's voice warned me back to the situation at hand. So, why, Rinsho? I said, looking up, my course of action decided. Why did you bring me back here when I had already freed you from Ishiyama and allowed you to follow me out into the world?
That's the simplest part of it all, Duncan,
Koji answered me instead of Rinsho.
He has to have his revenge, and he thought that if he could convince you to somehow destroy me, then he would finally win.
Rinsho smiled at his father's statement.
Why, father, even after all this time, I thought you would never understand such a plot. I do, my son, I do indeed, Koji replied. "That was why I separated you from Duncan in the caves and led him to my dog tag. Now he holds both our fates." Koji walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder, nodding to me with a pleading look in his eye that urged me to do the right thing. "Destroy these, Duncan. Destroy them both, and free us both." Koji turned to his son. "I am tired of this, my son, and despite our nightly struggles, I have long since forgiven you of your sins. Come now, let us end this as we began it, together." Rinsho's face contorted, and he repelled at the sight of his father's outstretched hand. "I will do no such thing, father," Rinsho replied. Koji turned to me, a worried look in his eyes. "Duncan, you must run. He will sooner kill you than see his plans defeated. He would doom you to our fate, just as he did the both of us. Run!" Rinsho's form contorted upon hearing his father's plea, and my would-be friend hunched over as if to retch. But instead of retching, Rinsho's form turned, morphing into something else, something I dreaded to find in the dark of Ishiyama. Rinsho's transformation took only a moment, and his new giant feline form did not hesitate to leap up at me, a killing attack that I knew I had no hope to survive. Koji interjected himself once more and shoved me out of the way of the big cat's lunge. I recovered briefly in time to witness Koji's ghostly form begin to fade as Rinsho mauled at his father. But this would be the last time. In a moment of prescient clarity, I took the cloth in both hands and ripped it down the middle. Rinsho snarled and screamed, an outcry both human and feline in sound, as I damaged his link to this world. It was all the time Koji needed to gain the upper hand in the spectral showdown. "Run, Duncan! I cannot hold him forever!" Koji pummeled the giant cat as it still reeled from my shredding of the cloth. I tossed the cloth aside, turned, and ran. I ran until my legs burned. I ran until my lungs threatened to give way. I ran until no sound but my own ragged breaths rang so loudly in the halls that I feared my eardrums might burst from the echoes. And there I was, at the portal. How I managed to make the right turns to get back there will forever remain a mystery to me. I dove headfirst through the opening, even as the sound and snarl of a giant cat suddenly called out from behind me. I felt a glancing blow to my leg as I withdrew into the portal in the rock wall, and I scrambled as quickly as I could to reach the access tunnels on the other side. My leg burned from the gash that was in it, and it was several minutes of wandering through the tunnels, down which Rinsho had led me only hours before. I stopped to survey the damage. The same wound I suffered weeks before in Ishiyama was now open again, a perfect recreation of the gash as it previously existed. But this time, I tore off a section of my own shirt to quickly bind it and continue onward. It was some hours later that I finally found my way back to the house from which our evening's journey had originally commenced. I retrieved my coat and hat, still hanging in their spot from the night before, and ventured out into the early morning hours in the Kobe district, blending into the growing crowds after a few blocks' walk. Nobody noticed the slight limp with which I walked all the way back to my penthouse, to the endless confusion of my doorman, who was sure that I was already in my home. Some months later, I received a handwritten letter expensively delivered via jumpship courier from an address in the Capellan Confederation. It thanked me for my donation of a piece of history to the Capellan Solaris 7 Legends section of the Capital Heritage Museum, and took one more attempt to get me to reveal where I had found such a well-preserved and cared-for dog tag that had once belonged to one of the most successful and tragic arena competitors in the Confederation's history. In time, I grew to question much of the events of that night. From the troublesome sight of the pristine cave walls, in which, from all of the footage and stills I have seen since of the sections of Ishiyama, through which I trudged, looked battered and beaten from years of matches, to the reasons and logics behind the motivations, and the final fates of both Rinsho and Koji, everything makes less and less sense the more I attempt to puzzle it out. Upon seeking medical attention for the wound I received, The surgeon reported that he had found a small but badly infected piece of mech armor that had embedded itself deeply into my flesh and remained undetected the first time the wound was injured. When I asked him about the significance of the infection, he asked me if I had experienced any symptoms of ceramite poisoning, any fevers, hallucinations, lucid dreams, and so forth. I denied any such afflictions and thanked him for his treatment and concerns. Perhaps I will never know what really happened that night, or those weeks, after my initial match in Ishiyama. But whatever truths or mysteries remain in that place, I always keep a wary eye on my view screens when announcing the matches there, both hoping to see something amiss and glad that I never do. Shadows of Ishiyama was written by D.G. Martin. Music and sound design by Jon Steadman. Produced and performed by George Ledoux and Voices in My Head Productions.